You who do not know me, my name is Louis Monroy. I am an assistant professor in international relations at Javeriana University here in Bogota, Colombia. I am a conflict and peace researcher. My main areas of focus have been the Western Balkans.
Hello.
Hello. Welcome. So my main areas of focus have been the Western Balkans, particularly the post-conflict experiences of Kosovo and Bosnia-Herzegovina. But of course, coming from Colombia, I have many years of living here, of studying here, and understanding also the Colombian armed conflict. So I have an interest in understanding issues of conflict, resolution, peace building, and particularly transitional justice. Okay, so everyone, I'm going to try to share my screen with you. Um, Hopefully we won't have any technical problems. Let me just check that everything works. 1 second. Okay, there we go. So as I said, I come from Colombia, and I have been focusing a lot of my research on peace building. So I look at what peace building is, what type of activities entail the realm of post-conflict peace building, and I criticize particularly liberal approaches to peace building. So I have that mind frame, but also because I live in Colombia and because of my professional career, I have worked also on an area of studies called critical terrorism studies that looks at, terrorism as a phenomenon, the causes, the consequences. It looks at issues of sort of recruitment, suicide terrorism, particular methods within terrorism. And as I have combined sort of these two areas of study, I always have sort of this key question about, how do we relate? How do we connect the two of them? Because they seem to address many similar things. They seem to have a focus on reducing violence, and they seem to have a focus on asking the questions of what causes violence and how do we deal with it. But unfortunately, academia and practice has focused way too much on separating these two worlds, as if terrorism was one thing and peace building was something completely different. And within what I have researched, it's more the things that connect the two and the opportunities that you can have, hence the concept of connections between counterterrorism and peace building, rather than the things that separate them. But the practice is where the problems occur. So my talk is going to be focused on a bit of an academic debate on what are the relations and misrelations between terrorism, counterterrorism, and peace building, and sort of looking critically at certain practices. And underneath it all, there's this question of how can peace and conflict studies, which is the realm that I most focus on, can help us understand terrorism and can help us understand those conflicts that are marked by terrorist violence. So that's sort of the objective of today, to show and to prove to you through this discussion. And the first thing that I need to say is there's an important context, a very difficult one, but one that we must admit that sort of displays in the middle of this discussion. And it is, of course, the impact that the September 11th attacks and their aftermath have had on peace building. So there are three things that we have seen and three possibilities that we have regarding peace building post a 9/11 world. First is that peace building is now underpinned by hard security priorities by the United States, by the great powers and regional hegemons. So whereas in the 90s, peace building had these discussions about state building and infrastructure and nation building and different activities that showed sort of a wide extension of peace building, after 9/11, I'm not saying that they have completely disappeared, but it seems like the priority tends to be, the military option, the hardcore security option, protection and control, law enforcement, rather than all the other processes that entail peace building. So we can see a voice that prioritizes, that military component of peace building above everything else. And you can see it in scenarios like Afghanistan and Iraq, where the intervention had a big military component, and then everything else sort of lagged behind. The state building process and society building came just way, way too late after that big military component. The second is a possibility. a possibility that we have now of shifting back to the 90s liberal peace building. And liberal peace building is pretty much focused on rebuilding states, rebuilding institutions, and creating sort of this top-down approach to reconstructing a society. And that's what peace building was understood back then. And today we're talking about that when we have discussions about fragile states, about dealing with the core problems of administration, of politics within a country as a solution to violent conflict, right? So by building a state, you are within this mentality helping avoid conflict or preventing conflict. And the third one, which is more wishful thinking than anything else at this point, ideally speaking, would be that the international community deepens and expands its approaches to peace building. These are debates about connecting the international with the local, developing top-down and bottom-up approaches. And in that sense, well, it's a goal, it's an ideal, but there are too many obstacles to this goal at this point, and this is what I want to describe. So let's look at this academically. So first of all, it's the issue of terrorism and terrorism studies. The problem that I find with this academic space is that terrorism focuses so much on defining its object of study, of creating a concept of terrorism, that it kind of thinks that it is the only concept that is very difficult to define. Generally, when I teach about terrorism, my first class is about defining and understanding theories of terrorism, and all the authors seem to say, well, we can't agree on this. This is such a complicated term, it's full of complexities, and this is what makes this field special. But for me as a peace building practitioner, I go, well, reconciliation has the same problem, peace has the same problem, conflict analysis has the same problem. There's nothing really particularly unique about being unable to define terrorism because it happens in other areas. But unfortunately, terrorism studies focuses so much on proving that it's sort of this unique and very different realm of study. And why is this problematic? Because when you look at it in policy, in decision making, there's this refusal of adopting other frameworks for understanding the terrorism. So people tend to ignore the work that conflict resolution and conflict transformation has done in investigating terrorism and its solution. It's sort of like feeling that peace building, mediation, communication has got nothing to do with terrorism. And I think that that's where the problem begins. Additionally to that, terrorism has started to adopt a critical take. And the critical take sort of focuses on the fact that we should stop looking at terrorism incidents separately, but we should look at them as problems of power relations. And in that sense, it brings a range of complexity, and it says, we should really have this discourse on power when talking about terrorist attacks, suicide terrorism, and all these different issues. And it's something that can connect to other realms. We're always talking about being multidisciplinary. So developing a psychological angle on terrorism, developing an anthropological, sociological angle. And in that sense, there's this call for exploring more from different areas about terrorism than, the sort of traditional, hardcore defense strategies. So to put it all in summary, the problem with terrorism studies is that it has exceptionalized its object of inquiry. It focuses so much on defining terrorism and stating that it is so difficult to define that it separates the study of terrorism from studying conflict, from conflict theory, from international relations, or political theory. And I think here is where we start to have a problem, because there will be a voice within terrorism that states the importance of studying it via that hard security, traditional state-centric approach, different from other possibilities that come from, other disciplines or other theoretical perspectives. So what happens with this realm of terrorism studies? First of all, it's very state-centric, and that's sort of the dominant voice. We have to look at the state to understand both the problems of terrorism and how to resolve them, because the state appears to be the ultimate referent object. It's that thing that we need to defend and we need to save from adversaries, from terrorists. But the other option, the one that comes from peace building, is seeing terrorism as a particular form of conflict, one that has underlying root causes, one that has changing dynamics, escalation, and can be seen through things like the human security approach or the conflict transformation approach. So in that sense, a study from this perspective of terrorism will ask questions about what causes this violence, what surrounds the violence, and what is changed and transformed by that violence. It opens up the discussion rather than the state-centric one, which is only concerned with controlling terrorism. You can understand it, but only to control it, to find a way to eliminate it. But it doesn't talk about, these underlying elements of conflict, right? And one of the key points where you can stop being academic and start beginning your empirical work is by discussing counterterrorism. This is, for me, the space where policy and theory often meet. This is the space where we can actually think, okay, so what actually can we do on the ground? And, this is where academics and policymakers kind of connect with states and connect with governments and practitioners to kind of figure out, okay, how do we deal with this issue and what are the frames for dealing with this issue? And for me, I think there's a big space where here peace building and security approaches could learn from one another, because peace building is concerned with avoiding violence and creating structures for sustainable peace. Counterterrorism is also interested in avoiding violence, albeit terrorist violence, but it's also concerned with that particular dynamic and how to stop it. So they both have a similar aim. It's just that the discussions and the parameters for peace building and terrorism are often very, very different. Okay. Now, when we look at terrorism in the literature, academic literature, we have different options. And this is one thing that I want you all to keep your mind open, that this brings a lot of connections, but also a lot of problems. So first of all, there's the discussion that by the capture or death of a leader, terrorism ends. So the case of Al-Qaeda and how 9/11 was the biggest hit, the biggest moment for Al-Qaeda, but at the same time, it led to diminishing its operation, diminishing it as sort of this global power that it thought to be. And it ended in the capture of death of a leader, and it ended up, breaking the infrastructures, the franchise building of that organization. So in that sense, there's a concern with the military operations. That would be sort of the mainstream conservative view of counterterrorism. In other cases, terrorism ends by the achievement of goals of an organization. So here I have a picture from the Maoist guerrillas in Nepal, who actually, through fight and through turning into insurgencies, they won the war and they got into governments. And many of the fighters of the Maoist guerrillas actually became soldiers of the Nepalese army. So in that sense, it is actually by territorial conquest and by becoming an insurgency, becoming a more organized structure, that terrorism sort of ends, because it has to become more political and it has to have sort of this mindset that allows it to either fight to achieve its goal or to find ways to promote its political ideals, whatever they may be. The third one is failure to influence the next generations. There's a lot of experiences in my part of the world, in a lot of Latin American countries, where the rhetoric of certain guerrillas in the 50s, 60s, and 70s has not caught on to the newer generations in the same way as the original leaders were thinking. So it kind of, the message gets lost after the passing of a few decades. And it's interesting because this propels a lot of people to talk about youth work as a way to dealing with terrorism, something that's completely different from the traditional political and security kind of perspectives. There's a concern with stop old organizations influencing young people and you will stop terrorism. The other one, the IRA, is the traditional case. So where you have a political transition where, a terrorist organization will become insurgency and then become sort of a political party, or becomes sort of this advocate civil society, political representation type of organization, and changes its behavior altogether. So the IRA is the perfect example of that, where you can actually see that mediation, bargaining, and political negotiation actually can help end terrorism. So it proves that the old voice of we don't negotiate with terrorists is not necessarily true. The IRA proves it. Unfortunately, in the case of Northern Ireland, it took too long. From the 70s to the Good Friday Agreement, if we look at that time frame, there was a lot of time lost because the perspective was put on the IRA being a terrorist group, and only till people and negotiators starting understanding it as a political organization, then could terrorism sort of cease. The other one is destroying social support. So the idea that you have to undermine the legitimacy of a guerrilla organization or of a terrorist group so that it no longer has a connection, it no longer can recruit people from society and kind of question their ground-based loyalty. By destroying the ground-based loyalty, you disrupt its ability to push propaganda forward and its ability to recruit pool of people for society, from society to join the ranks of a terrorist organization. The other one, very typical in Colombia, for example, is the transition from terrorism to other forms of violence. So the fluctuation between being a terrorist group, being an insurgency, moving towards a criminal organization. In the case of Colombia, then we have drug trafficking that has changed the outlook and perspective of illegal armed groups in the country. So they move from groups that have political ideals or have a strategic plan to becoming criminal organizations. They can also happen, when contexts where there are raw materials or access to the state that gives you a particular personal or economic benefit, and then your focus is not on the political goals, but rather on the economic gains that you get out of political violence. And the last one, state repression. So a situation where generally authoritarian states or an authoritarian approach ends up eliminating a common enemy or an identified enemy. So here I put the picture of Augusto Pinochet and the Chilean regime, where through a dictatorship, a military dictatorship, you boost the military campaign, you destroy the enemy, but in that sense, this brings a lot of questions about, human rights respect and, the rule of law, because this is often done either through very dark tactics or often done by eliminating and suppressing human rights. Another key example of state repression would be the Sri Lankan conflict, where the relationship between the Sinhalese and the Tamils was mediated by understanding the Tamils organization, the Tamil Tigers, as a terrorist organization and repressing it, through the hardcore military objective, but repressing it to the point where it isn't just the terrorist organization, but also the society, the ethnic groups that were tied to the Tamil cause that also suffered. So here you can see different possibilities. All of them have, their pluses and their negatives. Some are more dangerous than others. But what this tells us is, it doesn't need to be only this. It doesn't need to be only that hardcore security approach. It can be a range of other things. And I think this is kind of the call for this talk. Unfortunately, what we see in policy terms is that the approach to fighting terrorism in many countries, whether Western or non-Western, from the global North or the global South, is that fighting terrorism has been state-centric, that the main concern is the survival of the state from a common enemy. And this leads to, obviously, policing and militaristic approaches. So the obvious one is the invasion of Afghanistan and Iraq. Others, for example, in the case of the UK, is getting the police to understand more, the neighbor relations and controlling particular populations, and kind of figuring out where the terrorist threat is inside a particular society. The problem with this approach, and I'm not saying that it shouldn't be done, but it needs to be complemented with other things, is that this cuts the possibility of understanding communication and negotiation as a way to deal with those grievances that give rise to terrorist groups. So in a sense, and I put it there at the end, the concept of we don't negotiate with terrorists comes back with a strong voice in a lot of these societies. And I have seen this across, societies in the North and the South. So it becomes very, very problematic that this voice always becomes the key priority above everything else. And added to that, I want you to really think about this dilemma, which is I've put here 4 different groups. I could have put 10 or 20 different organizations, Al-Qaeda, ISIS, FARC in Colombia, even the Kosovo Liberation Army, if you wanted to. A lot of them were being put there under the realm of terrorist groups after 9/11. They all put the same label, and that label is politically used by governments to kind of pressure the military or the police to pursue these groups. But if you think about it, there's very little in common between these 4 organizations. Some are leaning towards the left, some are leaning to the right, some have ethnic kind of concerns, ethnic grievances. So you cannot really say that counterterrorism is effective when it puts the same label and it kind of reproduces the same approach in all these different contexts. All these different groups have been kind of attacked via this militaristic security approach. And the question is, well, how come we have this one size fits all vision of how to do counterterrorism? Should we just always apprehend and pursue and put in jail and kill organizations, or are there other spaces for engaging in better ways with, you know, the threat of terrorism? And this is where a new framework comes in place. And I want to bring this author, Katerina Stepanova, who brings three concepts to the table to understand this dilemma. The first one is counterterrorism, so the usual, you know, traditional one. And she says, look, this is a security task. It should be done by a national or an international authority, depending on the context. And the focus is eliminating a terrorist threat. That is the conventional, you know, traditional understanding of counterterrorism. Now, compared with peace building. Peace building, then, it's a range of activities. They're geared towards maintaining sustainable peace, avoid a repetition of violence. So here they have that bit of an element of eliminating a terrorist threat. But peace building opens up the possibilities for activities. Peace building includes reconciliation practices, democratization, NGO work, transitional justice, disarmament and demobilization of combatants, security sector reform, etc., etc. It's more open towards the different possibilities of engagement than counterterrorism. So Katerina says, look, we can combine them through this concept of anti-terrorism. You know, it isn't just countering, it isn't just cutting the threat, it's actually doing something a bit more. And she kind of combines both definitions. He says anti-terrorism is using political, legal, economic, democratic, civil society, and other peace-building instruments for countering as well as preventing terrorism. So she is stating, look, it's about cutting the violence, but it's actually also looking at what causes that particular violence, and, you know, how do we deal with all these causes and dynamics and escalation and changes. So she's advocating for something far much more open than the traditional counterterrorism discourse. Now, this has a problem that I'm always concerned about, which is, it's very good that we bring peace building into the debate of counterterrorism and anti-terrorism, but peace building isn't the solution all on its own. Peace building has its own problems. And those problems seem to be very similar to the problem of mainstream conservative approaches to terrorism, which is the following. Liberal peace building is often done by high politics, by a top-down interventionist formula that focuses a lot on institutions. We build institutions that promote capitalism, that promote democracy, that promote stability, and in that sense, we solve the problem of war. And it sounds very similar to what orthodox dominant approaches to terrorism do. In terrorism, the discussion is, well, we boost the institution of the police, we boost the institution of the judicial system, we boost the institution of the army, and in that sense, we control terrorism. You know, it focuses so much on institutions, and it ignores everything else. So in that sense, we have a problem here, a problem of efficiency and legitimacy that affects both peace building and counterterrorism. Efficiency because institutions fail, and institutions don't always bring the peace that they promote or the security that they promote. And legitimacy because a lot of this is thought from international spheres, international discourses. So here I put some pictures of Sarajevo that show that critique to liberal peace, and that critique of, you know, saying we're tired of interventions, we're tired of other formats. And in that sense, there's sort of a resistance to peace building and a resistance to counterterrorism. You can see that, you know, the bringing of these foreign formulas as a one-size-fits-all approach, it brings a lot of problems. So I admire Stepanovas' framework, but I put this caveat: be careful. Don't let this format become just about building institutions. Because if you don't talk to the people on the ground, if you don't talk to victims, you don't talk to the people that fear actually terrorism, then you might be missing the point of where you want to get with counterterrorism or with your peace building practice. Okay, but digging deep into Stepanovas' framework, I really find it interesting because it isn't just about the mainstream approach. It brings so many different components, and it speaks a lot to sort of the modern thought of how to do more holistic counterterrorism. So she builds it into three spaces. The first one is the hardcore security context. And she says this is a short-term device. This needs to contain the immediate threats. And she says, well, it's the usual. It is policing, it is law enforcement, it is military approaches, but they need to be a little bit more open. And she says, you know, this involves gathering intelligence, but it isn't just gathering intelligence to stop the acts, but actually intelligence that understands where those groups are recruiting people from, and it understands, you know, the rhetoric, the ideology. If it's about Islamic terrorism, then it focuses a lot on the effects of martyrdom and how martyrdom can bring new recruits to organizations like ISIS, Al-Qaeda. It also talks about counterinsurgency, you know, talking about the political component and how to fight ideologically, you know, the messages that are being sent by a particular organization. And it also has to do with, you know, war crime issues, and particularly within the context of peace building, you know, what do we do with those heroes that, you know, are war criminals and just go away or disappear and then form something different new, or with spoilers of a particular peace agreement who can actually bring back new different forms of violence. So she says, yes, security context is important, but it isn't just training the police or getting a big army to deal with this. It includes more different elements. She adds that the political and legal aspect as the midterm, you know, sort of the basis of the construction of a framework. And she says, look, you need to protect the peace process. If there are spoilers, if there's lack of commitment, you will see violence, you will see new groups arising, and you will see new different attacks. So terrorism might shift when a peace process is not protected and not properly respected, because if trust building breaks down, then organizations will have sort of this perfect excuse for engaging into violence. Again, Colombia is a good example of that, where we've had different peace processes, all have failed because of lack of political commitment, or most of them have failed for lack of political commitment. And then you see a new group appear, or you see, you know, the usual groups just reorganize and have new grievances against the government because a peace process has failed. But apart from this, she says, look at political governance, look at institutions, look at the functions of these institutions and how legitimate they are. And this is a place for fighting terrorism. If people trust better, you know, their political system, if they trust their institutions, then you know, they will access them better than access, you know, other agents that might be illegal and that might be outside the realm of the state. So in that sense, when she talks about the political and legal, she's bringing peace building. She's saying, you know, use the political, use the power politics, use the top-down interventions, but just gear it towards promoting sustainable peace and preventing violence. Don't gear it just to build institutions, but actually build it based on victims' needs, build it on, you know, the security situation of a country, and in that sense, it brings another element. But she combines this with the third realm, which is equally important. She says there's a development goal for this, and it's long-term, it's socioeconomic. So for her, this idea of connecting security and peace building goes through development. You have to develop economic institutions, you have to do development and economic reform, and it should be focused on addressing the root causes of those conflicts that generate terrorism. And here I would like to make a particular you know, notice, or send a particular message. It isn't that poverty causes terrorism. There's no proof of that linear relation. Okay, there are countries that are poor and have terrorism, and there are countries that are poor and don't have terrorism. So you cannot make that particular line. But if you work on development as a way to get people to have welfare, well-being, a satisfied standard of living, you're reducing the incentives for when things go wrong, they take weapons. For when things go wrong, they jump into violence. So in that sense, the work of development isn't necessarily a straightforward counterterrorism goal, but it does help. And it helps particularly with the issue of recruitment. So in that sense, you can see that this is much more extended, much more holistic than, you know, the hardcore traditional perspectives of counterterrorism. And just to, I'm very aware of time, so I will just conclude with this. Expanding counterterrorism and thinking about the connections between counterterrorism and peace building, well, it forces us to look at many, many different activities. And those activities should be both top down and bottom up. And it should help deal with different forms of threat, not just the threat that comes from the immediate element of violence that comes from terrorism. So people like David Coltright have come up with this idea that, based on UN discussions and based on academic discussions of all the different fronts of counterterrorism. So here we have things like dealing with the factors that are conducive to terrorism. This, in conflict transformation terms, is dealing with, the underlying roots of violence and dealing with grievances. Now, the problem with this language is that in counterterrorism circles and policy circles, people don't like the concept of underlying roots of conflict because it sounds like you're giving legitimacy to a terrorist group. So you cannot say the underlying roots of conflict of ISIS, of Al Qaeda, because you're actually giving them some sort of authority or moral recognition. And for a lot of policy circles, well, that's a complicated debate to have. But you can still deal with the factors that make people join a terrorist organization. And within that language, it's not that far away. What are the difficulties in a country, in a society that force people to engage with this type of political violence? And I think it's still, a lot of that conflict transformation theory of understanding the root causes of conflict that can help counter terrorism. The other one, working on social and economic development. This is groundbreaking because for a lot of approaches, like in the 20th century, this was not a possibility. You do not think about employment as a solution to terrorism or health policy, education policy, but now we can afford to do that. And it sort of goes to the theories of greed and grievance. I don't know if you've read people like Paul Collier, who have worked a lot on this, stating that in societies where you have high levels of unemployment, with high levels of young men who are unemployed, if they continue to have this sort of ongoing issue of poverty, they're bound to take weapons. And it's not to say that poverty again causes terrorism, but that the conditions might give you the option, or the only option for you to take weapons. So if you work on, literacy and education and job opportunities, you're actually curtailing the intention of young people of joining illegal armed groups, of joining terrorist organizations. The third area, so protecting human rights and really upholding them, fighting against the denial of human rights and upholding the rule of law. It sounds like it's exactly the opposite of terrorism. So the more you can concentrate on a state, a government, and a society respecting human rights and all of the plethora of human rights, then that discourse might help curtail any extremist radical discourse on the type of violence and the mobilization of terrorist groups. So actually, on the agenda of counterterrorism, human rights should be right at the top. But unfortunately, you've probably heard in many contexts that there's this myth, this idea that in order to be more safe, then you need to diminish or limit certain liberties and certain rights. But I think there's a risk there, because when you start reducing people's liberties, you are giving terrorist organizations sort of a bit of legitimacy when they're contesting you for particularly being or undemocratic or unrepresentative of the people. So that discourse that liberties come at the expense of security can be problematic in counterterrorism. The fourth one is the traditional one. Yes, we need to prevent and control. We need to have the policing. We need to have the military operations. No one is kind of getting rid of that. But these security operations need to have different angles. And one of them, the one that catches my attention the most, is to have better community relations. And in a lot of the contexts that I've worked on, there are severe questions about the police, about anti-riot police, or about, security forces that are curtailing peacebuilding operations. There needs to be a better connection, better civilian oversight, and ongoing dialogue between the security forces and the people. If you don't add that sort of civilian component of thinking about prevent and control, then you're going to have people resenting your police, you're going to have people resenting, an international occupation, and bring new problems. The case of Afghanistan and Iraq is very, very significant of this. The fact that you have a military operation heavy on, the security element gave rise to suicide terrorism. And a lot of the motivations of suicide terrorists in this context has been to kind of contest and denounce that international occupation, mainly because, you know, you have seen the excessive force of the military, excessive force of police forces, and then it creates a new type of tension, a new type of conflict. So hence the call for doing prevent and control, but doing it with this sort of civilian component. Think about police or military and society relations as an element of counterterrorism, particularly because you want people to help identify the threats that they see on the street, and you want people to kind of contribute when, you know, their lives are at stake, and you want people to trust the security institutions. Trust building becomes very important. The other one is very technical, but equally important: how to address the finances of terrorism. Where does terrorism get its money from, and how to curtail that? So globalization, discourses about you know, the global economy appear here as another element of counterterrorism. You know, what do we do with, for example, the process of blood diamonds in the context of conflicts in like Sierra Leone or Liberia, or, you know, sort of what is happening in the DRC. In the context of Colombia, of course, a concern with drug trafficking, illegal smuggling, you know, and its connection with the rest of the world, the cocaine trade. So these debates that are not necessarily military, but they require tapping into financial assets, tapping into financial institutions, are part of the realm of counterterrorism. And the last one, but not the least important, actually engage with issues of mediation and conflict transformation, promote dialogue, promote communication to help deal with the grievances that will later boost the creation of these criminal terrorist organizations. In the context of Colombia, for instance, if you look at the rise of guerrillas like FARC and ELN, you know, at some point in history, there were peasant groups who had a grievance against the state. If there had been a better communication and relation between the state and these groups, through mediation, through understanding, through better outreach, probably things could have been a bit different to a certain extent. But of course, when there is a lack of communication, a lack of understanding of what these groups are suffering or what they're asking for, then that's when they will eventually become illegal terrorist organizations or insurgencies. So just to cut the conversation and to leave 10 minutes for Q&A, the call for this connecting peace building with counterterrorism is just a necessity of expanding the way peace and conflict sees itself, of the way terrorism sees itself, and kind of explore more possibilities. Because the tendency has been very narrow, very top-down on the peace-building side, or very narrow militaristic operations on the terrorism side that simply have not produced true results if their aim is to curtail and counter that type of terrorist violence. So I will stop there and leave it for possible Q&A.
Thank you very much, Louis, for your talk and presentation. If anyone has any questions, we can do it by, you can say in the chat that you've got a question, or you can unmute yourself and go ahead with that. Are there any questions?
Yes, my name is Amin Bonifacio from Ghana. I have a question. Please, I wanted to know the role that the civil society organizations and the NGOs can play in fighting against terrorism in our communities. Because in Ghana here, we have quite a number of NGOs and civil society organizations. And I'm wondering how they could also help in fighting against terrorism in our community. Because in developing countries, I'm very happy that when you give the presentation, you said something about poverty and then unemployment, it having some kind of a role to play in terrorism in our world. So I'm very happy that you spoke about it. But I wanted to know the role that the civil society organizations and the NGOs can play in fight against terrorism. Thank you.
Sure, I mean, a great question. I think, I mean, there are many answers to this, but I think one of the key things that civil society organizations always need to remember is they are both a channel for sort of people's concerns and people's problems towards the state without becoming a political party, right? So in that sense, NGOs become watchdogs, and NGOs become these organizations that do development work, that do conflict transformation. So the route, well, it would be very, but at the end of the day, you should work with whatever are the root causes of problems. And because you're located at the field, you're located with the people, you're probably better positioned to understand what they are and to promote practice to help deal that on an everyday manner. So, for instance, where you need to promote conflict mediation, I have seen this in countries like Kenya or Ethiopia, where you can stop pastoralist type of conflicts by just having someone that can communicate from one pastoralist community to the other and avoid those type of conflicts to escalating to the ongoing problems of Al-Shabaab in Somalia, or the Al-Qaeda remnants of this country. So sometimes it's just a matter of having people with the know-how, with the knowledge of things like conflict transformation, conflict mediation on one hand, or on the development side, how to deal with these socioeconomic problems that when solving them, you avoid people going desperate and joining criminal organizations. I have this concern in the context where I used to work in Bosnia, where all the reports seem to point out that there's a lure of certain people in Bosnia towards groups like ISIS or before Al-Qaeda, mainly because of a socioeconomic concern, not because of an ideological alignment straight away, but because people are desperate. And, some of them have joined these groups. Now, that's not a mainstream issue like it is in other countries, but within a country as small as Bosnia, it is a significant problem. And the solution to that, it's not something massive. It's just try to get these people, a job, try to get them, some sense of well-being, and you will stop them from joining and becoming foreign fighters. But unfortunately, the Bosnian political model, it's very complex. I'm not going to discuss that in detail. It's not the point of this conversation, but it affects young people's opportunities to get a job, and not all of them, of course, but there will be a cater of people that might be prone to radicalization and out of desperation go and join these groups. So again, it's development work, understanding what are the needs of the people, what are the key problems, and try to find local capacities for dealing with that, as well with sort of the conflict transformation, communication, mediation knowledge that you can apply when things are problematic at the local. You want to stop them from escalating into this sort of terrorist, more national or even more global dimension of the problem. I don't know if that answered your question, but it would depend on the Ghanaian experience to give you a more detailed answer, I guess.
Yes, you have. Yes, I'm okay. I'm okay with your response. Thank you very much.
Okay, no, thank you.
Are there any other questions about?
Yeah. I have a question. I wonder the case about the terrorist groups about ethnicity. For example, there were some 6 topics that you showed us. And for example, it's not easy to deal with the first thing that you said about grievance. For example, it's not easy to provide, for example, they want independence or something like that. So in such cases, do you believe that if one terrorist groups ends or governments can stop it, then how can be the other next terrorist groups can be stopped? I mean the future ones, because it's not so easy to provide their wishes.
Of course. No, of course, the negotiation is a two-way street, right? But I mean, I understand the concern, but there's another side to that question, which is what happens when you are always demonizing a group with the label of terrorism and you do not negotiate with them, right? So the case of, I mentioned it before, Northern Ireland and the IRA, or Spain and ETA, such a long time discussing and deeming them as terrorists, where there's a lack of talk and there's a lack of understanding of what they're all about politically. And then, you know, it comes a point where you have this stalemate, the situation where you have to say, look, enough is enough. We've had enough violence. Let's try a different means. Unfortunately, it's out of the failure of counterterrorism. So in your point, yes, it's very hard to kind of stop this tendency when the problems keep going, this tendency of new groups appearing. Colombia is a very good example. We fought paramilitaries for a long time. We had a demobilization process with them, and they've seemed to come back. So we can't seem to get rid of the tendency about that, but that has to do with looking at the underlying roots of conflict. And again, this would be a call for peace building. You know, do your conflict analysis, do ongoing checks on the field of why are people upset, where are the grievances, and try to put, you know, policies and practices in promotion to stop, you know, those problems from becoming violence. It is an ongoing problem, and it's an ongoing endeavor. That's the issue, because the international community and peace building itself wants quick fix solutions, but this is a call for the long term. And I think if you want to stop this tendency long term, if you want to stop the repetition of violence, you need to be constantly checking what's happening in the field and checking what's happening with people and how they feel about a peace agreement, how they feel about transitional justice, how they feel about what is going on with whatever post-conflict is. But if you think that a peace agreement is going to solve the problems, if you think that, you know, this hard security issues will just stop it and that's it, that tends to be very naive. You know, the practice shows us that, you know, the best counterterrorism efforts have brought what we call negative peace, but haven't brought sort of this sustained approach. For example, in Northern Ireland, despite the fact that there's no war, there's a distance between the communities, and there are many concerns about what can happen when, you know, things like the agreements break down, or where people get tired of politics and they take, you know, matters into their own hands. You know, there's always that ghost of the lack of reconciliation. So you need to keep going, you need to keep monitoring, and you need to keep you know, checking what is happening with these underlying issues of conflict.
Thank you.
So I think we've got time for one more question, which is, Bettina has put a question in the chat, which I'll read for the sake of the recording. Oh, there's two questions. So we'll do these two questions as the last that are in the chat now, and then move on. The first one is, in the UK, we had the case of Shamima Begum, a girl who joined ISIS as a teenager and was trying to return to the UK as a British citizen with a newborn baby that she had in Syria. The vast majority of people supported the government's action to strip her nationality, particularly as she claimed that she had no regrets in joining ISIS. Do you think that for people like Shamima, who have no remorse for joining a terrorist organization, we should place our efforts in the form of anti-terrorism, in spite of them already having made their choice to become a terrorist?
Okay, great question. I use actually Shamima Begum's case in my classes here in Colombia. I find it a very fascinating case. There are many questions. First of all, how media portrays Shamima Begum, and particularly her comments about the Manchester terrorist attacks, that kind of put, you know, that debate into the political realm. But let's not forget, she was, what, I think 13 when she joined ISIS, or she was just a teenager. And I think that brings, you know, a lot of questions that can be dealt with psychology and sociology and other kind of disciplines. I think that in the case of Shamima Begum, well, it's important to kind of, I don't know what would be the term in English, but to kind of follow up on, you know, what she's doing. But by banning her and by not allowing her back into the country, well, it sends a message to certain communities, certain religions, certain, you know, the Muslim community in the UK, that added to other problems that come out of counterterrorism in the UK, like the effect of the Prevent Act on Islamic communities, bring all these problems that lead to lack of trust from communities towards police, or lack of trust with the government, and that will affect terrorism endeavors in the long term. So, you know, we cannot take the words of a 13-year-old, albeit, you know, being radicalized and all that, just as the sworn statement of how she's always going to behave. We have to keep tabs on her. We have to check, you know, how people like that who have been radicalized can be readapted to societies back in the UK. And it's a very difficult process. There's no simple solution to that. It involves education, it involves social work, it involves a big effort. And I know that a lot of societies, particularly in post-conflict settings, let's take it outside of the UK, can afford, don't have the money or don't have the resources for doing that. But you have to fight not only the intent of violence, but the discourse, the rhetoric, the elements that lead to extremism, to radicalization. So I guess it needs more different forms of efforts than just banning someone or being very radical about, they don't belong here, they shouldn't be here.
The last question then is, what would be the effective peace-building policy that could be applied today in the fight against terrorist groups, in your opinion?
Right. Well, that would be very obviously country specific. I'm not an advocate of one size fits all or giving a formula, but I would say a policy that understands really what is happening on the ground, that understands what are people's needs. If we're talking about coming out of war, what are the victims' needs? What are, the survivors' needs, which are often neglected and in the long term can become sources for instability that leads to joining other groups. So all the possible efforts that come from peace building, the efforts that come from, understanding how to demobilize combatants, that understands how to deal with a better justice process, deal with a better security sector reform, deal with a better civil society. All those efforts that connect what happens on the ground with what happens in the high political level, that would be an effective peace building policy, not just for fighting terrorism groups, but for actually sustaining peace and guaranteeing that there's no repetition of violence. Take, for instance, the Bosnian case. One of the things that astounds me about the history of the Bosnian 90s conflict is the arrival of mujahideens to defend Bosniaks during the 90s as sort of a big first moment of the modern study of foreign fighters. And then now people are talking about the concern about Wahhabism arriving to Bosnia, changing the more European Muslim outlook of Bosnia, and that can lead to the rise of a new form of terrorism. And people kind of separate the two as if there was no connection. And it's like, wait, there were some grievances in the 90s against the Muslims, and Mujahideen, some stayed, and with what has been going on with state building and peace building, those grievances have been amplified. And with the international context, well, boom, you have this issue of foreign fighters. But you have to really understand what happens on the ground, what happens with people, in order to have that more effective both peace building and effective counterterrorism.